Hi guys, today I want to demonstrate how we can take two pieces of this olive wood which has recently come out of the kiln and turn them into some nice trays. The wood, as you can see, is a bit of an odd shape, slightly too small for a table. Some side tables I was thinking of, but I thought the best option would be to make some serving trays. I've already run the two pieces of wood through my router sled. I'm not going to demonstrate it in this video as I've covered it a few times in videos before, but I'll leave the links in the description below that you can see how we use a router sled. And in fact, if you want to build your own router sled, there's a video on that as well. So at the moment I'm measuring out each piece of wood. I'm going to try and get two pieces, two trays out of one piece and three trays out of the other. The width of the trays being around 16 centimeters and the length 60 centimeters, which are the standard size of the multi-purpose molds that we sell. The measurements don't need to be exact, but it just gives you a good indication of what you'll be able to achieve with the end products. The olive wood that you can see here is all locally sourced in Andalusia, with the trees having come to an end of their natural life. Olive wood, as you know, is very dense wood, so the natural drying time can be years. So we put it in the kiln, 5 weeks, gets it down to about 7 or 8%, and also kills any bugs. So here we're trimming the wood so it sits snugly in the mould, which also reduces the amount of resin required. With all the resin projects that we do, depending on the size obviously, whether they're coffee tables, dining tables or trays as we have here, we always try and use the maximum amount of wood and the minimum amount of resin, particularly with olive wood, which finishes beautifully. The resin should complement it rather than being the main feature of the project. So knowing that the width of the mold is 60 centimeters, 600 millimeters, I'm trimming the wood to 595 millimeters, so it'll give us 2.5 mil at either end. There's a few finishing touches that we need to do before we move the wood into the mold. Remove any unsightly knots, which you can see here is on the side, one of the sides, and also increase the splits, the natural splits that occur in the wood, which when they're filled with resin look great. Unfortunately, if they're too thin, the resin doesn't penetrate. So here what we're going to do is just get our Dremel tool, just increase the size of them slightly, and that will allow the resin to flow in and set. What this will do also is remove any of the hair size strips of wood between the splits, which can cause air bubbles to form underneath. And in the finishing process becomes an arduous task trying to get the resin in. So this will also get rid of them. So moving on to the mold, here we have our 1 meter by 60 centimeter multi-purpose mold, which comes with inserts. So it allows you to do projects smaller than 1 meter by 60 centimeters without wasting resin. The molds are made from 12 millimeter half-inch HDPE plastic, which is the perfect material for epoxy resin projects, as the resin doesn't stick. There's no need for release spray or duct tape. Once the resin's been set, then the project is very easily removed. Threaded inserts and machine bolts attach the sides to the mold. The mold can be constructed in under a couple of minutes, and the most important thing of all is that the molds are completely reusable. So once it's done, a light sanding or a cleaning of the mold, then it's then good to go for another project. So before we silicone the edges of the mold, we just put the wood in and make sure it's all aligned properly. Obviously making sure you get the wood the right way up. And then we can put the inserts in, just mark the edges or the sides of the molds with a marker pen. And then when you take the wood out, you know the position of the inserts to silicone them with inside the mold. So we're almost ready to pour the resin. Prior to doing so, we need to silicone the sides of the molds or the edges of the mold just to prevent any leaks. A standard kitchen or bathroom silicone is sufficient, and preferably black, just so you can see any bits that have been missed. The inserts can then be siliconed in place with reference to the marks that have been made with the marker pen before. Making sure the mold is level, particularly when the mold spans 1 meter, is something which is quite often overlooked. Even a couple of millimeters incline or decline to one end will result in wasted resin and additional finishing work. There are other molds on the market which come with leveling feet and cheap mini spirit levels attached to the sides. These two gimmicks are a complete waste of time. The mold should be placed on a sturdy surface or table, and then that table or surface should then be leveled, making sure that the entirety of the mold is in contact with the table. So before we move on to the resin, just giving the mold and the wood a once over with the hoover, just to remove any excess debris. It's a bit of a thumb suck with regards to how much resin we're going to need for these two trays, but certainly when you're calculating in centimeters, it makes it much easier because 1,000 cubic centimeters equals 1 litre. So what I did was measure the two molds individually, 60 centimeters by 48 centimeters with a 4 centimeter depth, gives you 11,520 cubic centimeters. And the smaller mold is 54 centimeters by 32 centimeters with a 4 centimeter depth, which gives you 6,912. So you add those two together, gives you 18,432 cubic centimeters, which is equal to more or less 18.5 litres. So 18.5 litres would be the amount of resin required to fill both the moulds without any wood being present. I then hazard a guess that the wood probably took up around 80% of the mould, which would then require 20% of resin. Just adding a little bit extra, 10%, just to be on the safe side, I worked out that 30% of 18.5 litres would be necessary, which gave me a total of 5.5 litres of resin. So here I'm using Epoxy, which I've mixed into a large bucket with a translucent colouring. Let it stand for 10-15 minutes or so, let any bubbles rise to the surface, and then you can remove them with a heat gun. Now transfer it into a smaller bucket, which just makes pouring more accurate. And also reduces the possibility of any unmixed resin entering into the project. So the Epoxy I'm using is a flow cast system, ratio of 2:1. It says it's up to a maximum of 38 millimeters. We're pouring to 4 centimeters, 40 millimeters. But I've used it a few times in the past, up to 45 millimeters actually, and it's worked quite well. So the intention is to completely submerge both pieces of wood under the resin, just pouring so there's a couple of millimeters of resin on top of the wood, which will allow the resin to seep into the natural curves and splits in the wood. Then brush the sides of the wood, removing any air which has possibly been trapped underneath. I don't seal the sides or in fact the top and the bottom of the wood. I've found that as long as the wood is kiln dried, which removes any bugs and gets the wood down to a decent humidity of between 7 and 9%, then there's no necessity to seal the sides. So coming back to it after half or an hour or so, all the bubbles that have risen to the surface can now be removed with a heat gun. One of the nice things about this flow cast system from Eco Epoxy is that I only had to come back to it once. So I left it for half an hour or so, and then that was it. The bubbles had come to the surface and they could be removed. I bought this resin on a Friday afternoon and then went away for the weekend. Came back on Monday, had a look, and we had a leak. Nothing too strenuous, didn't ruin anything. Certainly not the first leak I've had. I'm sure it won't be the last, but it just goes to show that we should be more meticulous with the application of the silicone to the sides. Just make sure it's every bit is covered. So from the Friday to the Monday morning, the resin was hard. I thought I'd leave it another 24 hours. So on the Tuesday morning, came back to it, just removed the machine screws, and then the sides came off very easily. I've lost count of the number of times that I've used this mold. The only requirement between pours being the cleaning of the surface and the sides of the mold with some acetone or alcohol-based product. In fact, the silicone sticks to the mold more so than the resin, but that can quite easily be peeled off. The second mistake I made was not laying a plastic sheet on top of the table underneath the mold, which prevents the mold sticking to the table in the event of a leak, which obviously we had. Fortunately, the leak wasn't that bad. The table wasn't damaged too much. I can sand that out. But it's just a good idea when you do these projects, just to protect yourself. Just cover the table with a plastic sheet. So the last side comes off together with the inserts, and you can see that the silicone is easily peeled away from the mold. So before we move on to the work that's going to be required on the underside of the mold, refilling any holes, any voids, etc., I'm just going to give the mold a quick wipe, clean it with some acetone as I mentioned, and then rebuild it. It's always a good idea to rebuild the mold whilst it's not in use, whilst it's in storage. It just helps it keep its shape. So now we can see the work that's going to be required on the underside of the trays. Obviously, on the closed crevices, the resin hasn't been able to flow into because of the air trapped inside it. So that's going to need some attention. In addition to that, we've got an air bubble which we're going to need to drill out just a couple of holes to allow us to pour some resin in. So the first job will be to drill a couple of holes in the air bubble which has formed, just using an M8 wood bit. Two holes I'm going to drill, one to pour the resin in, and then the other hole will allow the air to escape. Then I get going with the Dremel, increase the aperture of the two holes that I've just drilled, and I can also use it on the other areas of the underside, just to allow the resin to flow into those areas more easily. The resin I'm using here is the UV epoxy from Epoxy, which should be set in 24 hours or so. It's always a little bit tricky getting the ratios of colorant to the resin, particularly for these small amounts. So I leave the colorant out and just pour it clear, and then it will take on its background color. So again, transferring it from the mixture cup into an unused cup, just to prevent any unmixed resin going into the project. Then for the larger holes, we can just use the cup to pour it in. Use a cocktail stick or a match just to give it a bit of a poke, each of the holes a bit of a poke afterwards, just to make sure that no air has been trapped. The smaller holes and cracks can prove to be a little bit more problematic, as the viscosity of the resin doesn't allow the air inside to escape. The best method I've come across so far is to use a syringe. That way you can insert the resin at the bottom of the hole, thereby allowing the air to escape. This is particularly useful for the very fine cracks. I mean, there are some cracks that I've come across where you keep filling and filling with resin, and it doesn't seem to flow to the top. This is generally because the crack goes all the way to the other side, and when you lift up the piece, you'll see a damp patch on the underside. The way to get around this is to wipe the underside clean, make sure it's nice and dry, and then just put a bit of duct tape over it, a bit of packing tape or so. This will create a dam, and then you'll be able to pour the resin from the top without it leaking out of the bottom. Probably spent a good couple of hours making good on the bottom of the trays, and in fact on the top, where there were some small holes that needed to be filled, but it doesn't make sense going through it in this video. So then it's down to the router sled, a quick once over, just to make sure everything's level. So both trays are now level. I've probably taken off 3 or 4 mil either side, which will then give me about 28 mil in thickness. Before I cut the trays into 2 and into 3 pieces, as I've measured out before, I'm just going to trim the sides to see how much wood is exposed. It's always a bit messy trimming the sides when you're cutting less than the thickness of the blade. It creates a mess regardless of the extraction that you have. But as you can see here, the wood on 2 of the sides isn't very apparent, so I'm going to trim a little bit more off, 2 or 3 mil, to see if I can get some more wood exposed. So only by reducing a couple of millimeters off the side, we can get some more wood exposed, which makes the tray substantially more attractive. So moving on to the finishing process, I've been over this numerous times in other videos that I've done, so I'm not going to labour the point today. Suffice to say that I'm starting off with a 120 grit, which I can do as a result of the router bit being quite sharp, so it leaves quite a good finish. So start with a 120, 180, 240, 320, and then 400, obviously making sure to clean the surface between changing the grits. The finish I'll use is going to be the Osmo Top Oil, which is a food safe finish. It's quite viscous, so you need to apply it quite liberally. Let it sink in for half an hour, and then you can wipe it off and then give it a quick buff, which will bring the resin up. So that's all for now, guys. I hope you found the video informative. If you're interested in buying any of the reusable epoxy resin molds, then just go to rivertables.es and you'll find the resin molds page. I'll put a discount code in the details below, which will give you a discount on that, and in fact on the kiln dried olive wood, which we also sell. As always, please feel free to leave a comment in the section below with any questions or advice that you may have. I always get back to people within 24 hours or so. And what really helps us is if you get the chance to subscribe. Thanks for watching.